Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fashoyin-Aje, for taking time to talk to me about diversity efforts at FDA. Yeah, so starting off, what's your take on the state of diversity in cancer drug development? It's a broad question, which groups are disadvantaged and underrepresented. I'm aware NCI-funded trials have seen marked improvement over the past 2 decades, but where is industry on this?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this. First, let me say that diversity is a broad concept that can mean a lot of things. Often when the term diversity is used, the reference is usually racial and ethnic diversity. But in the Oncology Center of Excellence, or the OCE, and at FDA more broadly, when we promote diverse representation in clinical trials, we are thinking about it across demographic factors like race, ethnicity, sex, age, across clinical characteristics that may impact outcomes. And then all of this really needs to be considered in the context of the entire drug development program, not just the single trial and not just the pivotal trial. And especially in oncology, we need to be thinking about diversity in the context of global drug development. So there's really a lot to unpack there, but this is really important. And to answer your question more directly, the groups in cancer trials that we see consistently underrepresented relative to their representation among cases of the disease are participants who are members of racial and ethnic groups known to be underrepresented in clinical research in general. So Blacks, Hispanics, older adults, et cetera. And from the clinical perspective, the oncology drug development ecosystem has had, too high a tolerance really for high toxicity. And this has led to really stringent clinical criteria for enrolling in clinical trials, such that the clinical trial participation is really different than the patients in the real world setting who receive the drugs once they are approved. So we need to embrace a more inclusive approach to trial entry criteria to better match the trial population to the population that will receive the drug. And it's really challenging, I think, to optimally develop a drug that is intended to improve population outcomes when the trial population is so narrowly defined. And I think from a global perspective, we need to optimize the opportunities for achieving diversity by bringing other regions, countries into the clinical trial enterprise, so to speak. So trial participants from regions like Africa, Central and South America are really woefully underrepresented in oncology trials. So global diversity is very much in alignment with the goals of evaluating drugs in a population that provides the opportunity to not only understand differential drug effects, but also to potentially learn about the disease itself. So we really think about diversity much more broadly. And I think the events in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that really highlighted disparities that have existed for a long time, and the murder of Mr. Floyd, we are really seeing that sponsors are mobilizing their teams to address this problem more proactively.
That's really good to hear. Yeah, and in a related development, a November 2020 FDA guidance contains, non-binding recommendations to enhance diversity in clinical trials. Could you describe some of the more crucial provisions, especially those that have a bearing on oncology trials?
Sure, I can't say that there are considerations that are in that guidance that are especially unique to oncology. Many of the factors that contribute to disparities in enrollment and retention rates across subgroups that are defined by demographic characteristics like race are really cross-cutting across therapeutic areas. But the existing FDA guidances on the topic of diversity, related to the topic of diversity, really provide recommendations on tangible measures that can be implemented to address these barriers. And they typically comprise measures that may address trial-specific barriers like eligibility criteria, that may address excessively burdensome trial-related procedures and testing during the trial, measures that address more structural ecosystem-related barriers such as site selection, investigator selection, et cetera, and also measures that can really cultivate trust with the affected communities. Obviously, there's no one set of factors that is the sole quote unquote fix to this problem, but these measures are really need to be implemented in parallel and by multiple stakeholders. Really, everyone has a stake in this, and everyone has accountability for this. So I think those provisions are really helpful to think about in a proactive way,
Got it. And
prospective way.
a perspective way indeed. And speaking of stakeholders, this is a 30,000-foot level question. What is FDA's approach, as a matter of philosophy and strategic leadership, as a role or style, to diversifying enrollment in trials? I also see that you are the lead for Project Equity, a truly unprecedented program in the Oncology Center of Excellence to improve representation in clinical research.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what I described earlier about our sort of broad view of what diversity means, I won't reiterate, but I would say that, we recently published a perspective in JAMA Oncology this past summer on why it's really important to address diversity in cancer drug development and why this has been a priority for the OCE for many years. We need to focus on correcting what has been for many, many years, an unfortunate disparity in access to potentially novel therapies through clinical trial participation. And, just as equally important, disparity in sort of the amount of evidence that's being generated across more diverse populations. So our approach is multi-pronged, focusing on outreach, engagement, collaboration, policy development and implementation, and research and information sharing. And I would refer your readers to our perspective piece in JAMA Oncology.
Right, yeah, I've read it, and leading on from that, that is your vision for the OCE. But also, what are some actionable measures that you can take? You've got a prospectus, but what can you do? And could you explain why these steps are really important for reducing disparities, especially where they pertain to underserved racial and ethnic minorities, Black and Hispanic populations, as you mentioned, in the overall US cancer patient population?
Yeah, I think we recognize that the factors that contribute to this problem are interrelated and can seem really daunting for any one entity to undertake. And I think the challenge sometimes is really convincing folks that we need not wait until we have an all-encompassing and perfect approach to really get working on this issue. Dr. Pazder likes to remind us not to let perfection be the enemy of the good. So we must really recognize the value and the learning that comes with really moving from kind of a talking space, all the roundtables, all the assessments and the workshops, to sort of the doing phase of things. And as I mentioned, we all have a part that we can work on. From an OCE perspective, we believe that thinking about diversity really early in drug development is key to actually moving from the discussion stage that I referenced earlier to the doing stage. So we are asking sponsors to develop and submit their plans for enrolling diverse population in their trials. These measures should be implemented as early as possible, including for those studies that are conducted to characterize the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics of a drug. We're also taking a look at well-known barriers like eligibility criteria, and we've been working on this for many years with other stakeholders, but really just being a bit more proactive in developing guidances for considerations around eligibility criteria, and also being more vigilant when we are reviewing protocols to ensure that sponsors are actually following those guidances. I think another area with growing interest is in the implementation of measures that really mitigate some of the burdens of participating in a clinical trial. Encouraging aspects of clinical trial decentralization as an example, even though this is not sort of a new concept, I think that there has been increased visibility and interest in some of those measures as a way to really mitigate the burden to patients who are participating in the clinical trials. But we want to do that and maintain patient safety. We want to preserve study integrity. We want to ensure that there's quality data at the end of the day that really answers the scientific question. So some of these things are not necessarily within the FDA purview. So there needs to be, infrastructure that's being built at the community level to support the decentralization measures. But we certainly support that approach. Finally, I think that there's also increased recognition that real world data and real world evidence can be really useful in addressing knowledge gaps when it's appropriately used. So we have had ongoing efforts really to help us understand how these types of data can be used, again, in the appropriate context, taking care not to really relegate generating evidence for historically underrepresented groups to just the real world data and real world evidence, as really these cannot and should not be used in lieu of the clinical trials, which is still represents the gold standard to characterizing safety and effectiveness of new drugs. So there's really very tangible things that can be done and that we are doing in the Oncology Center of Excellence to move the needle on this issue, at least from our perspective and within our purview.
Right, right. And the 21st Century Cures Act makes that quite clear. This next question is slightly multifaceted. Can and should pediatric trials serve as a proof of concept or as a pilot project for achieving, adequate representation of racial and ethnic minorities, or is it really more of a, maybe a stepping stone is not needed for FDA to apply these principles to adult trials? And the reason I ask this is because I noticed that there is indeed a statutory requirement in the BPCA, or the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act of 2002, to do so. So does this give FDA, any kind of enforcement authority? Is that useful? What is FDA's thinking on this?
Yeah, I think it certainly does give FDA authority, enforcement authority on this issue. And we at the OC are taking a really close look at how often we have enforced this authority. But I think, we support, and promote and really want to see clinical trials in all populations really serve those populations, not only in providing access to the drug, but also just in generating evidence to support the safe and effective use of these therapies across a diverse group of patients. So I think while the pediatric case is a specific authority, in other settings, I think even without the explicit authority, we can all do a lot more to drive adequate representation in clinical trials. So I agree that there's definitely enforcement authority in the pediatric space, but that shouldn't be, hopefully, that shouldn't be the only thing that drives change. Drives change in diversifying clinical trials.
Got it. Yeah, and could you provide an example of an unmet need in oncology within the context of this conversation? For instance, in which cancer types, do you observe stark disparities in access to trials, care, patient outcomes, and what can you do at FDA to alter those realities?
Well, I'm not sure there's a particular disease that is really deserving of more attention than others. There are certainly some diseases that are disproportionately affect, for example, racial and ethnic minorities and or older adults, where there really should be a lot of focus to ensure that the data that are generated from the trials are generalizable to those populations. There are some diseases like multiple myeloma, for example, where there are known biological differences in the disease presentation that track with race or track with age, where really specific attention, I think, is required to ensure, again, that we are really evaluating new therapies, taking into account those known differences. There may be other biological factors, drivers of cancer that are not exclusive to one group, but that may be more prevalent in one group compared to another. And we may not uncover those differences without a more inclusive approach to trial enrollment of these populations. So I guess to answer your question shortly, I think that we are so far behind where we need to be in terms of conducting inclusive drug development programs that I don't think focusing on one trial or one disease area is the appropriate approach, because as I mentioned, many of the barriers, once they're addressed, will really benefit not even just the underserved or underrepresented population, it'll benefit all patients. So it's really critical to take a much broader look at kind of the whole ecosystem. And once that is done, we can really change how we're doing things.
Got it. Yeah, and what are some real world examples of the unique barriers, that drug development companies face in improving diversity in cancer trials? And maybe I forgot to ask, what are also some consequences, if these barriers stay in place, not only for the companies but also for the patients?
Well, I think this is really a question for pharmaceutical companies, but I would say that there's no question that it's a gargantuan task, right? To go from decades of not having a prospective and comprehensive approach to addressing this issue to doing so in 2021. I think some companies have made great strides in that direction over a number of years now, but it's certainly not the majority. And I think a big barrier for companies really is a cultural view of the importance of diversity and the value of diversity. I think in my view, the conversation and really the tone of the conversation tends to be too focused, I think, on the risks and not really enough on the value and the benefits of diversity. So it's really important to be, I think it's really important to be transparent really about what is viewed as a risk, right? But I think that what will really fundamentally lead to change is really a shift from this view that diversity poses risks to drug development to a view that there's uncertainty that has to be embraced if we're really going to change. So I think sponsors, pharmaceutical sponsors are probably better equipped to respond to this question, but I think there really needs to be a fundamental view change or paradigm shift in terms of how diversity is viewed in drug development.
Right, and this is a follow-up question. I have to say that I really am not familiar with the view that diversity or an approach to increasing diversity is considered more of a risk, when it comes to designing protocols or encouraging diverse enrollment. What does that risk mean? I'm not sure I understand that part. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand it either, but I think that there's a general view that the more heterogeneous that the study population is, the more noise you introduce to the investigation and more difficult and challenging it may be to detect drug effects. And I think there's also a view that, enrolling populations that have typically not been enrolled in clinical trials, that there's a great deal of uncertainty regarding what the outcomes may be, and that, and that unknown is risky, right? I think a third concern and consideration that I've heard is that there is a lot of time and expense spent on enrolling these subgroups or members of these subgroups in the clinical trial, and that the risks to the trial may be, if one sets enrollment targets or enrollment goals, the risks would be that you slow down enrollment, or maybe you don't completely accrue in the trial. So I think that there are sort of the view around risks have been sort of conveyed by industry across many different levels with many different considerations, and so I think it'd be interesting to kind of move away from that focus and into more of what is the value that diversity brings. What are the opportunities for learning about drug effects across a population, and true improvements in outcomes? Can we characterize those better? And what is the value of extending the clinical trial enterprise to regions that are typically not represented, where you may have such richness in genetic diversity that would really inform understanding of the diseases and drug effects in those diseases.
Got it. Thank you for expounding on that. Yeah, and so what should we be expecting to hear from FDA and the OCE over the next few months or year on these matters? What's in the works?
Well, we're working on the same issue. We've been working on the same issues since before 2020, and we'll continue to work on these issues until we really get to, to a place where we feel that we are really implementing some strategies that have been described and that have been successful in certain settings, that we're applying those more broadly. But that we're also learning from the experiences about how to do this and how to do this well. So that is what we expect to continue to do, and to continue to provide more transparency regarding our expectations as we learn more.
Got it. And what advice, if you have any, do you have for our readers, both at cancer centers and we have life sciences companies that read us on a weekly basis, for what they can do to help achieve the goals of Project Equity and FDA's larger approach to this?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I mean, I think it takes a village. We all have a part to play. We all have a part to play to do, and we all have a part to play to keep each other accountable. So I would say it takes a village, and everyone should do their part. I think the other is, Dr. Pazer's famous words, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. There is a lot of value in learning from our successes, but also from our failures. And we have to get started somewhere. And as we learn, we'll get better. Hopefully, that's the goal. Yeah. And I would say keep an open mind.
Got it. Yep. Did we miss anything?
Well, I think this conversation could go on and on and on, but I think we covered enough today. And I thank you for inviting us to participate in this interview.
Thank you so much for taking the time.